human history.
It explores the big questions of why we exist.
It's inspired many people to do amazing things.
And confused many others.
And you've probably got one sitting around somewhere.
So, what is the Bible actually?
Well, the Bible is a small library of books that all emerged out of the history of the people of ancient Israel. And in one sense, they were just like any other ancient civilization. But among them were a long line of individuals called prophets. And they viewed Israel's story as anything but ordinary. They saw it as a central part of what God was doing for all humanity. And these prophets were literary geniuses.
Really?
Yeah, they expertly crafted the Hebrew language to write epic narratives, very sophisticated poetry. They were masters of metaphor and storytelling, and they leveraged all of this to explore life's most complicated questions about death and life and the human struggle.
So, there's a lot of different authors writing this book.
Yeah, and these texts were produced over a 1,000-year period, starting with Israel's origins in Egypt, then leading up to their kingdom with their first temple, but eventually they were conquered by the Babylonians, who took them away into exile. Then, at a crucial moment in their history, many Israelites returned to their land. They built a second temple, they reformed their identity, and this is when the Jewish scriptures began to be formed into the shape that we have them today.
Okay, the Jewish Bible. What's in it?
Well, in Hebrew, it's called by an acronym, Tanakh. The T stands for Torah, sometimes called the Law. That's Israel's 5-book foundation story. The N stands for Nevi'im, the Hebrew word for prophets. And this section consists of the historical books that tell Israel's story from the prophet's point of view. Then you get the poetic books of the prophets themselves. The K stands for Ketuvim, the Hebrew word for writings. This is a diverse collection of poetic books, wisdom books, and more narrative. And the Jewish people believe that through all of these literary works, God speaks to his people.
Now, there were other Jewish writings being produced during this Second Temple period as well.
Yeah, a really diverse group of texts. And these too were highly valued in Jewish communities. And there was debate from ancient times about whether or not some of these should be considered part of their scriptures.
So, this is a lot of different writings over a long period of time. Why did they put them all together like this?
Well, altogether, these texts tell an epic story about how God is working through these people to bring order and beauty out of the chaos of our world. And it all builds up to a hope for a new leader who would come and renew all creation. And then the Tanakh concludes, and this leader never comes.
So it's an expertly crafted work, but it's missing an ending?
That's exactly right. Now, a few centuries later, a Jewish prophet comes onto the scene named Jesus of Nazareth. He claimed he was carrying the Tanakh story forward.
Yeah, so Jesus did a bunch of cool stuff, was killed, but his followers claimed he was alive from the dead.
Yeah, they said that Jesus was that long-awaited leader who would restore the world. And so his earliest followers, called apostles, they composed new literary works about the story of Jesus. They called these Good News, or the Gospel. They formed an account called Acts about the spread of the Jesus movement outside of Israel, and then they circulated letters to different Jesus communities all around the ancient world.
And they saw these writings as part of the scripture.
Yeah, the apostles wrote all of this as the fulfillment of that epic story found in the Tanakh, and they were continuing the literary genius of the Jewish tradition. They also believed that God was speaking to his people through these texts alongside the scriptures of Israel.
So that's the Old and New Testament. But what did the early Christians think of the other Second Temple literature?
Well, different groups had different views about some of these books, but we know they read them and valued these texts because they passed them along with the Jewish scriptures.
Okay, so we've got the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures. We got these other Second Temple period works. Then the writing of the apostles about Jesus. And that's a lot of literature, so what's in my Bible?
So the Christian movement has taken different forms over 2,000 years, and from the beginning, all Christians recognized the Tanakh and the New Testament as scripture. And for centuries, much of the Second Temple literature was read as part of the biblical tradition. The Catholic Church eventually made it official and called some of the books from this collection the Deuterocanonical books. Some Orthodox churches used even more books from this Second Temple literature. And then in the 1500s, during the Reformation, Protestant Christians wanted to go back to the oldest writings of the prophets and apostles, so they accepted only the Old and New Testaments.
Okay, I think I got it. But how does a collection of books produced over 1,000 years by all these different authors tell one unified story?
Yeah, that's the question we'll address in our next video.
Hey, I'm John.
And I'm Tim.
This is the Bible Project. We believe the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus.
You do that because of your support, so thanks so much, you guys.
Thanks.
The Bible's an important book, but it's really long.
Yeah, it's a collection of many books written over a long period of time, but altogether they tell one unified story.
So, what's the story of the Bible?
Well, it begins by introducing us to a beautiful mind, the author of all reality, a being called God. And he has the power to take the dark chaos of the uncreated world and bring about order and beauty and a garden full of life.
And to crown this accomplishment, God appoints these creatures called humanity,
Or in Hebrew, Adam,
and they're made as God's image.
which means that they're commissioned to rule this beautiful world on God's behalf by harnessing all of its potential and creating even more beauty and order.
This is a story about humans using their power to do meaningful, life-giving work. But the question is, how?
Yeah, humanity now faces a choice that's represented by a fruit tree. So humans could partner with God and find freedom by trusting in his knowledge of good and evil, or they could seize power and define good and evil on their own, which, God warns, will kill them.
And they hear the voice of a dark, mysterious creature that tells them the choice is simple. Take the fruit. It'll give you power and freedom to rule the world on your own terms.
And so they seize this knowledge, and as a result they become suspicious and self-protective. It leads to fractured relationships, violent power grabs, and ultimately a whole civilization, Babylon, that has redefined evil as good. And so, God scatters this corrupted human project.
And here the story of the Bible takes an important turn. We zoom into the story of a man and a woman who come out of Babylon, Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah, God promises that from them will come a new people, a nation that has another chance to make the right choice. And if they succeed, it will open up this new way forward for the rest of humanity.
And this is why the rest of the Bible story is about this family.
And it does not go well. Despite God's personal guidance, Abraham's family gives in to that same temptation to redefine good and evil on their own terms, apart from God.
Even when their best people were in charge, rulers who loved God's guidance and had divine wisdom, even they gave in.
And so Israel was warned by their own prophets that these choices would lead them back to Babylon, this time as conquered captives living in exile, and that's exactly what happened.
So even with God's personal guidance, Israel fails. Who can succeed?
Well, the prophet said that the story wasn't over. God's going to send a new leader to Israel to cover for their failures and to transform the people's hearts and minds so that they can make the right choice.
And so the part of the Bible called the Old Testament ends, and these promises are left hanging.
And then the biblical story continues into the New Testament. We're introduced to a man who comes from the line of Israel's kings, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said that he was bringing all these promises to their completion.
He confronted that dark, mysterious evil that all humanity is given into and resisted its power.
And then he announced that God had arrived to rule the world through himself. Jesus taught about God's definition of good and evil, and he said that real power is serving others. According to Jesus, it's people who love the poor and even love their enemies. These are the kind of people who actually rule the world.
And that's confusing, but also really beautiful.
And so is the claim that the story goes on to make about Jesus, that he is God become human, to be for Israel and for all humanity what we could never be for ourselves. He came to take the consequences of our evil into himself, and his sacrificial love proved more powerful than evil and even death itself.
So now humanity is presented with a new choice.
Represented by a new tree.
Stick with the old way of being human, or venture into this new way.
And in the story, those who choose the way of Jesus find themselves energized by God's own power. People who know that they are loved and forgiven by God can become people who love and forgive others in return.
The Jesus movement quickly spread throughout the world, forming these new communities of people who follow the way of Jesus.
But they faced problems. There was persecution from the outside by people in power, and inside there was confusion, even compromise.
Yeah, because following Jesus is really hard.
And so the movement's leaders, called apostles, they wrote letters to comfort and to challenge these communities to stay faithful to the difficult way of Jesus.
And they're called to hope for the day when Jesus will come and change everything.
And so the Bible ends by pointing to the future day, when all wrongs are made right, when evil is eradicated, heaven and earth are united, and humanity can rule the world together in the love and power of God.
Okay, so that's the story of the Bible, and it brings all of these books together.
But what's interesting is that each book contains a different kind of literature that contributes to the story in a unique way. And that's what the next video will begin to explore. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this Bible Project video. This is part 2 of our How to Read the Bible series. We've got a lot more of these.
That's like anything else, you can binge watch those. Alright, so those two I think do go hand in hand. Any thought, idea? Pretty straightforward, isn't it? Pretty good overview, kind of what this, because it's amazing, even sometimes we as people who have read the Bible for a majority of our lives kind of forget the overall theme and idea. What is it God's trying to get across to us and do, speak to us through. So anyway, hopefully this will kind of help as we go along. For those that weren't here last week, we just threw out a couple of ideas and a couple of things. One was this idea we keep coming back to about God's purpose and judgment and the way God uses judgment as a way to bring us back to Himself. His intention is always reconciliation, bringing us back to Himself. And they kind of talked about that in the second video. I asked the question why so many times it seems like that was necessary. But that's just kind of the struggle, and he mentioned it, the struggle that humanity faces. We want to go our own way. We think we know best. And despite the fact that we experience a loving God giving and being, toward us, we sometimes still just go our own way. And when we do, it gets us in trouble. We also mentioned number 2 is the ways that God revealed Himself, has revealed Himself, and does reveal Himself, and that what He's seeking from us is this relational knowledge. It's not just head knowledge. And even if you understood everything about the literary styles of the Bible and all there was to understand about the Bible, if you had degree upon degree and you claimed to understand it from beginning to end, without relational knowledge and relationship with God, it'd be useless, wouldn't it? Because the intention of this word is to bring us in relationship with Him. We also kind of stood on this. This one was one that we kind of hung around on a little bit last week, and that is because Hosea is the epitome of this. The uncommon things that God will ask you to do in obedience to His will sometimes. We've all had moments where what God was asking us to do it wasn't just uncommon, it just seemed downright nutty, didn't it? It's like, why? What purpose was that? Sometimes it's just little stuff. God moves on your heart to go speak to someone you don't know on aisle 6 at Walmart. And then sometimes it's big stuff. And this thing that He's asking Hosea to do is a big thing. I mean, it's a life-altering change, turn you upside down. And you think about, even in the context of our church family, think about some of the big turn your world upside down kind of things that have kind of come our way. And I mean, we could just list them when you're talking about Dave and Vicky's family with their granddaughter. Just thing after thing after thing after thing. And again, I'm not trying to connect them all together and say they all are identical. No, but what I am saying is sometimes we go through things that we never thought we'd have to go through. We go through things that are hard and that are difficult, but in those things, God reveals Himself to us personally. In this case, God is trying to speak to the whole nation, isn't He? And there is something about, we talked about the way that God would use the prophets and give them, what was the exact term we used? Basically, it was symbolic action, but I forgot what the official term I used back then. But these symbols, these sign acts that they did. If you lay on your side for X number of days, go around the street, you're going around prophesying naked all of those things that were just like, whoa, like really? God will ask us sometimes to do some things that defy our understanding, and yet we have to obey. What the Scripture is very clear, isn't it? Obedience is better than any level of sacrifice. So we're looking for lessons in Hosea's life, the lessons that God was speaking to the nation, and then what are the lessons for us? So that's kind of what we're trying to uncover. Chapter 1 and chapter 2 is God's commission to him when He's asking to do these hard things. And we stopped at 3, and you'll see why as we start reading. Now, comments, questions? I'm going to read. because I hadn't been yelling and screaming as much today. So, and I actually could see, so I'm gonna read, and you guys just stop me if you got something.
Something wrong before you go on that relational knowledge, a lot of these things that we do have to go through, when this is a living word. When I mentioned when I was asking the lesson a while ago, some of the things that we may have missed, in the past looking through this. Well, this is a living word. Absolutely. God can bring it back and show you that's that relational knowledge that we need. And sometimes we have to go through some of these things to really see, now that's what he meant.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, that's where this has got to be part of that relational knowledge. Because without the Word of God, how will we know?
Absolutely.
And then the trials and things come, and we learn from the Word of God how to deal with those things, how to make it through those.
Absolutely. Wow, that's very well said. Because we do find our encouragement through the difficult things we're going through from those who've also gone through it. Be our testimony, but also be our word. Because, there's not a whole lot of things that we face in 2022 that there's not a kind of a foundation for in Scripture, right? Whether you're talking about turmoil nationwide, or you're talking about individual betrayals, or you're talking about just your own heart that kind of wanders its own way and leads you in paths that you don't need to go down, and you listen too long to that dark pull of the enemy of our soul, and you find yourself lost as a ball in high weeds. But then you find the grace and mercy of a father who reaches out to the prodigal, right? To all of us as prodigals, and welcomes us back in. Chapter 3, verse 1, the Lord said to me, "Go again, love a woman who is loved by a lover and is committing adultery, just like the love of the Lord for the children of Israel, who look to other gods and love the raisin cakes of the pagans." So again, this is about that undying love. And Becky mentioned last week that Redeeming Love book written by Francine Rivers, and the way that it is the epitome of this, based on this story. This whole idea that God sends you to take a harlot, and we talked a little last week about that whole idea of a harlot, exactly what it was meaning, whether it was just more of one following pagan religions or part of that following pagan religions that involved, sexual sin and all that stuff. But this was a woman that, I don't know, whether he was individually told, there she is, because it doesn't really say that God said, there's the one, go take her. It says he tells him to go take a harlot. And so, however, he chose her, Gomer. God's trying to say to the nation, you've strayed. You're like her, whose heart is not completely given over to her husband, and you've drifted and wandered, and I want you back. All right. So I bought her for myself, verse 2, 15 shekels of silver, and 1 1/2 homers of barley. And I said to her, you shall stay with me many days. You shall not play the harlot, nor shall you have a man. So, too, will I be toward you. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, without ephod or teraphim. Afterward the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God, and David their king. They shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. Hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel, for the Lord brings a charge against the inhabitants of the land. There is no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land. By swearing and lying, killing and stealing and committing adultery, they break all restraint. With bloodshed upon bloodshed, therefore the land will mourn, and everyone who dwells there will waste away. With the beasts of the field and the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea will be taken away. And I pause there because one of the things that he mentioned a moment ago in the Bible Project was the literary genius of so many of these writers. Because sometimes, we kind of misunderstand the fact that these guys were not only being anointed by God, because again, I believe that the Word of God is God-breathed, it's inspired, it's given by God. These folk wrote as they were moved on by the Holy Spirit. Totally believe that. But having said that, God used the skill set and the knowledge and the literary ability that a lot of these guys had, whether you're talking about the prophets as they verbally spoke or you're talking about these written words. And so that's a powerful image right there, isn't it, of the devastation of sin. Think about even as that relates to us today. I was thinking about just look across America at a lot of our major cities that are just riddled by devastating crime. And when this describes, the blood upon bloodshed, the land mourning, that reality we all see, right? when you've got dozens of family members over any weekend in Chicago who have lost a loved one, and they're having a funeral, and they've lost this part, we see the devastation of that, of escalating violence and of bloodshed and of people turning away from the heart of God. Because at the end of the day, we can talk about the lack of strict sentencing or policing or whatever, but at the end of the day, it's the human heart, it's people, and their human heart turning toward other things than God, isn't it? And this is the result of that. Verse 4, now let no man contend or rebuke another, for your people are like those who contend with the priests. Therefore you shall stumble in the day. The prophet also shall stumble with you in the night, and I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being priest for me. Because you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. So that verse 6 is quoted a lot. And my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Thoughts, ideas? Yeah. Okay. I will also forget your children. Does he mean literally not remember? Turning away is a result of sin. Sin is distancing them from me. But remember, his intention is always restoration, reconciliation, bring them back. Judgment is to cause the heart of man to turn back to God. Verse 7, the more they increase, the more they sinned against me. And I will change their glory into shame. They eat up the sin of my people. They set their heart on their iniquity. And it shall be like people, like priests. So I will punish them for their ways and reward them for their deeds. For they shall eat but not have enough. They shall commit harlotry but not increase, because they have ceased obeying the Lord. And everything comes out of that obedience to the Lord, doesn't it? When you turn away from that, you bring not only heartache and trouble your way, but devastation in relationships, cities become corrupt, nations fall away. Harlotry, wine, and new wine enslave the heart. My people ask counsel from their wooden idols, and their staff informs them. For the spirit of harlotry has caused them to stray, and they have played the harlot against their God. The spirit of harlotry has caused them to stray. What do you think about that? The spirit of harlotry. There are characteristics that are kind of symbolic of or kind of work hand in hand with. Weeks ago when we talked about spiritual warfare, one of the topics was this whole idea of principalities and powers, right? Things that control areas. And I don't know what's at work in Las Vegas, over Las Vegas, but I know that it ain't good, is it? I mean, there are things that are at work that kind of control, that manifest themselves in heavy doses. People run to it, who are turning away from God. Harlotry, wine, and new wine enslave the heart. Verse 12. My people ask counsel from their wooden idols, and their staff informs them. For the spirit of harlotry has caused them to stray, and they have played the harlot against their God. They offer sacrifices on the mountaintops, and they burn incense on the hills, under oaks, poplars, and terebinths, because their shade is good. Therefore your daughters commit harlotry, and your brides commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they commit harlotry, nor your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go apart with harlots, and offer sacrifices with a ritual harlot. Therefore people who do not understand will be trampled. Though you, Israel, play the harlot, let not Judah offend. Do not come up to Gilgal, nor go up to Bethaven, nor swear any oath, saying, as the Lord lives. For Israel is stubborn like a stubborn calf. Now the Lord will let them forage like a lamb in open country. Ephraim is joined to idols. Let him alone. Their drink is rebellion. They commit harlotry continually. Her rulers dearly love dishonor. The wind has wrapped her up in its wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. Hear this, O priest. Take heed, O house of Israel. Give ear, O house of the king. For yours is the judgment, because you have been a snare to Mizpah, and a net spread on Tabor. The revolters are deeply involved in slaughter, though I rebuke them all. I know Ephraim, and Israel is not hidden from me. For now, O Ephraim, you commit harlotry. Israel is defiled. Now, again, I think there's a level of application that applied to those that heard this for the first time, don't you? That probably is missed on us. I can't unpack that in a way, with my limited knowledge. I can't unpack that in a way, but to fully understand what they understood about that. Again, it speaks through time to us, right? God's intention, His desire, the blessing that He wants for His people is thwarted, is corrupted. It's not allowed to happen as a result of the sin of mankind, right? Our hearts are turned away from Him. It's God saying, I want to bless you. I've called you. I want you to be fully mine. I want you to be controlled by the things that move my heart, your heart to beat like my heart beats. But I can't do that when you allow, all of these other things, when you follow after others. Even when they're talking about the trees that they went under, those are definitely references to idol worship and things, right? To sinful practices that other religions were using. They do not direct their deeds toward turning to their God. Verse 4, for the spirit of harlotry is in their midst, and they do not know the Lord. The pride of Israel testifies to His face. Therefore Israel and Ephraim stumble in their iniquity. Judah also stumbles with them. With their flocks and herds they shall go to seek the Lord, but they will not find Him. He has withdrawn Himself from them. They have dealt treacherously with the Lord, for they have begotten pagan children. Now a new moon shall devour them and their heritage. What do you make of that? They shall go to seek the Lord, but they will not find Him. He has withdrawn Himself from them. It's a sobering word, isn't it? We sometimes think, I think we as modern believers oftentimes fall in this category. We sort of think, well, I can just come to God any old time I want to. And we forget that the Spirit of God drawing you is a big part of a relationship with God. Now again, I know whosoever will, let him come. It's God's intention. And I know today is the day of salvation. But there are things that have to happen in the heart of men to turn to God that only the Spirit can orchestrate and create. And so when He says, they'll seek me, but they won't find, they won't find me because He withdrew Himself from them. Is that God being bad and doing something underhanded? And no, it's not that at all, is it?
Just trying to get your attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes the only way you know what you're missing is when you recognize that it's missing. Or you recognize, maybe a better way to say it is, you recognize what you have when it's missing. You don't realize how great the blessings are or how wonderful relationship with God is until there are those seasons you go through where you're troubled and where you keep just, the heavens feel like brass, so to speak. Now, I get this is a little bit different because he's talking about the spirit of harlotry and idolatry, and they're turning to other gods. It's not just this lukewarmness, but the application is very real for us, isn't it? Because, most of us are not going to just turn our back and walk away and thumb our nose up at God. I mean, we've tasted and seen, and we know we're not going to do that, but probably all of us, if we were honest, would agree that there are times that we become lukewarm, or that we become complacent, or that we become distracted by other things, and our heart's not fully toward God. I mean, and I'm not saying this it is kind of a critique, but on Sunday mornings, there are plenty of Sunday mornings that we as a people come here and we come with kind of that I can take it or leave it mentality. And I think as long as you come with a take it or leave it mentality, I can, but I don't necessarily have. When we don't seize the opportunity to be with God as a group, when we don't fully run to Him, that's a choice we make that grieves the heart of God. When it says don't grieve the Spirit, now again, I'm not trying to sound like I'm trying to be mean and mean-spirited about it, but I think all of us find ourselves, I for one find myself sometimes my mind drifting, and I recognize that I haven't made adequate preparation to come into the presence of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So all of us can kind of find ourselves there sometimes. Just stop.
We did some study on this a while back, like a long time ago. So, I'm not sure that we interpret this the way it's written.
Yeah.
If you look at the concordance on this, the he and the he withdrew are implied. They're not really words. They weren't part of the original text, right? So if you remove that, it just says that he was away from them, right? And I'm not sure that we distance ourselves from him. I'm not sure he moved.
Yeah.
We found ourselves wandering around, and when we get out there and we start calling from him, we can't find him. It's because we've moved away from him. So that might be a different way to look at how this is worded.
I think it's very well said, because that's the idea, I believe. I do believe that. I believe
There was distance, but I'm not sure he did the distancing as much as we did.
I was thinking kind of the same thing, but verse 6 says they shall go with their flocks and with their herds. That means they're not turning away from what they've been doing, they're trying to take it with them.
Yeah.
So they're still distracted, even though they're supposedly seeking the Lord, they've still got all this baggage.
Yeah.
With all the prosperity that they've gained out there.
Well, that's a good point. That's a really good point. Because for most of us, that's where we're most at, the temptation.
That stronghold that everybody
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Is sometimes the blessings are the things that distract us. The prosperity, the things that when things are going great. Most of us find a level, again, you can go through some things that you feel so distant and far away and you're like, I just can't. But most of the time when our back's against the wall, we get serious with God. Most of us, turn and fall to our knees and we realize, oh my word, I took a ton of things for granted. God, I need you, And we come in a real posture of aggressive seeking Him. And sometimes we don't have that, when we let ourselves drift or we let ourselves get complacent. Sometimes that's when we're the most blessed. They have begotten pagan children, verse 7, and that's a sobering analysis there too, because the next generation is feeding off how we live and do, isn't it? I mean, we can say all we want, do as I say, not as I do, but the reality is we know that children look to us, the next generation looks to us as an example of what they're supposed to be. I mean, we should be able to say like Paul did, follow me because I'm following Jesus. And if we can't say that, then there's a problem, right? They had begotten pagan children, strange children, my note says. Now a new moon shall devour them and their heritage. And again, when you're talking about not just one generation being impacted, but the next generation and the next generation. That's the scary part, and even I keep just coming back to this analysis with America. You just think about a generation of young people that don't understand work ethic or don't understand the idea of even hard work, the value of it. You lose things like that are cultural kind of things, that are fabric of society kind of stuff. But when you think about even relationship with God, think about how many people live their lives and their testimony is, we never grew up in church. I didn't know Adam and Eve. I didn't know any of the Bible stories or any of that kind of stuff. They were kind of way out there, and yet God reached to them. He got their attention. He spoke to them. They may have come to Him with a biblical IQ of 0, but God will work with that one. He'll work with biblical illiteracy if you want relationship with Him and if you recognize you need it. Blow the ram's horn in Gibeah, the trumpet in Ramah. Cry aloud at Beth-aven, verse 8. Look behind you, O Benjamin. Ephraim shall be desolate in the day of rebuke. Among the tribes of Israel I will make known what is sure. The princes of Judah are like those who remove a landmark. I will pour out my wrath on them like water. Ephraim is oppressed and broken in judgment. I wonder if 10 is as straightforward as it sounds. Those who remove a landmark. A landmark is put there as a reminder of what has been, right? And so those that remove those things, think about, again, the attack against our nation, and the whole attack is to take the things that have been commonplace and like the fabric of our culture and to uproot them. And it's kind of what we were talking about before dinner, is the fact that a lot of these crazy things we're seeing are an attempt to move the markers. They're an attempt to basically just obscure any landmark that was there, because if there's not a landmark for the next generation to look and say, hey, what's the story behind that? Because kids aren't even going to know there was a story there, right? They're not even going to. That's why, in my opinion, as a history teacher, history seems so far and distant and irrelevant to so many of them, because they don't understand how the stories of people that came 150 years ahead of them has anything to do with them. But it does, right? Because we know there's nothing new under the heavens. What has been will be. Ephraim shall be desolate, verse 9, in the day of rebuke. Among the tribes of Israel I will make known what is sure. The princes of Judah are like those who remove a landmark. I will pour out my wrath on them like water. Ephraim is oppressed and broken in judgment. Because he willingly walked by human precept, therefore I will be to Ephraim like a moth, and to the house of Judah like rottenness. Interesting. The note there is for Proverbs 12:4. We can flip there. To the house of Judah like rottenness. I will be to Ephraim like a moth. Like a moth. When Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah saw his wound, then Ephraim went to Assyria and sent to King Jeroboam. Yet he cannot cure you, nor heal you of your wound. For I will be like a lion to Ephraim, and like a young lion to the house of Judah. I will tear them and go away. I will take them away, and no one shall rescue. I will return again to my place till they acknowledge their offense. Then they will seek my face. In their affliction they will earnestly seek me. And again, up there in verse 13, where it says, they went to, let's see, where did it say? Judah saw his wounds, they went to Assyria, and they went to King Jeroboam. And again, just thinking about oftentimes we go to the wrong source. Kind of what Gene was alluding to a minute ago, we go to the wrong place. Come and let us return to the Lord, verse 6. And you feel a little wind of... For he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up. Isn't that interesting? Third day. All the way back here we see that reference to a third day. Him raising him up, third day. That we may live in his sight. Let us pursue the knowledge of the Lord. His going forth is established as in the morning. He will come to us like the rain, like the latter and the former rain to the earth. And again, there's two references there. One in Psalms, one in the book of Job. The former and the latter rain. And again, all this imagery sort of gets taken forward. Even we see it not only in other Old Testament writings, but also in the New Testament. These ideas, we just see them kind of come right back. O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? O Judah, what shall I do to you? Verse 4. For your faithfulness is like a morning cloud. Like the early dew, it goes away. Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth. And your judgments are like light that goes forth. For I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And again we see a reference to Matthew chapter 9 and Micah chapter 6. And the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. But like men, they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt treacherously with me. Gilead is a city of evildoers and defiled with blood. As bands of robbers lie in wait for a man, so the company of priests murder on the way to Shechem. Priests that murder on the way to Shechem. Surely they commit lewdness. I have seen a horrible thing in the house of Israel. There is the harlotry of Ephraim. Israel is defiled. Also, O Judah, a harvest is appointed for you when I return the captives of my people. When I would have healed Israel, then the iniquity of Ephraim was uncovered, and the wickedness of Samaria, for they have committed fraud. A thief comes in, a band of robbers, takes spoil outside. They do not consider in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. Now their own deeds have surrounded them. They are before my face. They make a king glad with their wickedness, and princes with their lies. That's interesting, isn't it? They do not consider in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. They do not consider in their hearts that I remember. They are all adulterers, verse 4, like an oven heated by a baker. He ceases stirring the fire after kneading the dough until it is leavened. In the day of our king, princes have made him sick, inflamed with wine. He stretched out his hand with scoffers. They prepare their heart like an oven while they lie in wait. Their baker sleeps all night. In the morning it burns like a flaming fire. They are all hot like an oven and have devoured their judges, and their kings have fallen. None among them calls upon me. Ephraim has mixed himself among the peoples. Ephraim is a cake unturned. Aliens have devoured a cake unturned. Aliens have devoured his strength, but he does not even know it. Yes, gray hairs are here and there on him, yet he does not even know it. And the pride of Israel testifies to his face that they did not return to the Lord their God, nor did they seek him for all this. Ephraim also is like a silly dove without sense. They call to Egypt, they go to Assyria. Wherever they go, I will spread my net on them. I will bring them down like birds of the air. I will chastise them according to what their congregation has heard. Woe to them, for they have fled from me. Destruction to them, because they have transgressed against me. Though I redeemed them, yet they have spoken lies against me. They did not cry out to me with their heart. When they wailed upon their beds, they assembled together for grain and new wine. They rebelled against me. Though I disciplined and strengthened their arms, yet they devised evil against me. They returned, but not to the Most High. They are like a treacherous bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword. For the cursings of their tongue, this shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. Shout out. I wish I had written them down and marked them already. He compares them to a dove. What were some of the other comparisons? What were some of the other comparisons that he made? Look back over those couple of chapters that we just read there. To a dove. The one right before that. I should have marked them and written them down for you. I'm sorry. There were about 4 there, weren't there? He said they're like this, they're like this.
Treacherous bow.
Treacherous bow. Undependable, right? We think treacherous bow. If it's bow like this kind of bow, right? So it's treacherous, you don't know where it's going to go. Undependable. Anybody see the other ones? I won't sit here and try to hunt them down in your presence, but it was pretty stark that there were several. As a matter of fact, they may even be on that list that I gave you. There may be others. That can be our homework to hunt those down. If you find them, jot them on the side of your paper there, and we'll kind of pick back up there next week with these imagery. Imagery is a powerful thing, isn't it? Because when I hear them talk about doves, the weird actions of doves and things there, I mean, can you totally see that in your head, can't you?
So they were stubborn like a heifer.
Stubborn like a heifer.
Well, that's why mine says, yours said calf.
Okay. A stubborn 2 B's?
The Israelites are stubborn, yes.
2
Like a
B's?
stubborn heifer.
Vicky's not your check stuff. None of those are positive, right? None of these are like good things. But again, can you identify? I can. Stubborn. Oh gosh. On any given day of the week, I get stubborn about it. Any given number of things. Sometimes it's consequential stuff, and sometimes it's, inconsequential stuff. Sometimes it doesn't seem to be that big a deal, does it? And then sometimes it can absolutely change the direction of your day and season you're in.
Like an oven also.
What was another one?
Like an oven.
Oven, yeah, oven, that was. What was it? What was it?
Like an unturned loaf.
Unturned loaf, yeah.
Yeah.
Alright. What are these called in ELA? I'm ashamed to say I should know. What do they call these things when you make these comparisons like this? I always get them confused between hyperbole and all the other things that they tested me on and I forgot and then quit talking about it. Metaphors. Metaphors are living characteristics of inanimate objects, right? Metaphors are, anyway. I'd like to stop there if that's okay. Final comments. That was a lot. I know that, to me there is power even in just reading the words. But when you start to kind of break it apart and dissect some of these things, I feel like there is so much that flies over our head when you're talking about the localized areas, you're talking about the kings that really don't register with us, but it would have registered very much to their history, right? If I said to you the era of Reagan, and I said to you, the times of Jimmy Carter, you automatically, some of us have been around a while, you got images in your head, right? Gas line, out the wazoo, gas going through the roof, you got, conflict here. I remember where I was at when I heard that. And that's the same kind, and you can't forget that, that's the same kind of response that some of these folks would have to that. And again, I know as it was read, down the road and people forgot, it's back to that landmark thing. anything, if the landmarks aren't laid out, and if the stories don't continue to be told, then there comes a generation that doesn't really know the significance of that. I mean, I see that every day in my classroom. Young people that don't understand the significance really of any of it. They've heard their grandpas talk about Vietnam, or they've heard their, whatever talk about this, but they've got no real understanding of why they should care, or why it's important. And then you've got yahoos and nincompoops throughout the country that are tearing statues down and are trying to rewrite the history books. Yeah. So you add that in with a group that really not sure why they ought to care. And I think a lot of the world is not somehow antagonistic necessarily. And I've said this for a long time. I don't know that so much of the world is antagonistic to the gospel of Jesus as much as they are just not only haven't heard it but seen it in action, or what they have seen is not the real thing. So that brings us back in the end here to salt and light. That our job is to somehow be salt and light in such a way that we give them the right picture of Jesus. That's the real challenge for all of us. That are we being the right picture of Jesus to the people that encounter us? Because as you've heard, since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, we're the only Jesus some will ever see. What they see in us and through us. Final comments before I pray?
The one thing that always gets me, especially reading through the Old Testament, we look at our world today and we say that people are falling away from God. They're falling away every day.
Mm-hmm.
But if we look back at Israel, all this wasn't that many years from when he led them out of captivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it seems to me like the whole world is just progressively gotten worse.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure it's just to his point. When you remove history, when you remove those stones of remembrance and why they were there,
Yeah.
then they're destined to make the same mistakes that have been made before them, right? So I don't know if it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, or we just keep making the same mistakes over and over and over.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because Fletch and I started the night talking about some of the work he'd been doing with his ancestry. And it kind of goes back to that same kind of thing. That's a message I always hound with all of my students is, you've got to make sure that when Grandma's talking, I know you've heard the story 35 times, but listen to the story because you're responsible to share that story with the next generation, or she fades out of the history books at some point. I mean, not history books, but she fades out of collective memory.
Yeah.
And it's kind of that way in every capacity, isn't it? And that's kind of what I say, is that most people are not going to end up making it into the American history books or the world history books. And the only way they're going to be remembered is through the stories that are told perpetually by generation after generation. And it requires some humility and a teachable spirit, doesn't it? And I'm as guilty as any, that sometimes you don't recognize how powerful and important it is for you to get the story and internalize it yourself so you can tell the story to the next generation.
When I was a kid, probably 14, 15 years old, we were in Europe, and we had a field trip to Verdun, France, which was a national battlefield that was part of World War II. And as you walk those grounds, it's a lot like Arlington, where you walk out, there's just crosses as far as you can see across the grounds. But there's a knoll in the middle of the cemetery. There's a great big building. It's stone, and it's probably 2 or 3 stories tall, I think. And when you walk up to that building, there's stairs that walk along each side and just take you up towards the top. And then when you get to the top level, you take like a spiral staircase down. And when you first walk up to it, there are little windows that are just little ports, basically, that you can peer into. And when you first start looking into those, it's pitch black. You can't see anything, right? But as you start walking those stairs up and you get higher and higher, more light from above starts filtering in, and you start seeing stuff that you can't really identify what it is. And at some point, just ahead of you, you'll hear people going, oh, oh. And it's a massive pile of human bones. And what happened is at the end of the war, the battlefield was so littered with bodies that were unidentifiable, and both sides were still fighting over that space. They couldn't get out to recover the dead. And at the end of the war, they weren't able to go back and identify them. They didn't have DNA, they didn't have all that kind of stuff. And so what they ended up doing is creating this monument, a mausoleum, if you would, that they just put all of these bodies in, right? And as you get to the very top, as you walk out, there's a big plaque. It's brass plaque, and it's in a bunch of different languages. And when you find English in that, it says, so the world will never forget. And it was a reminder to the devastation of war, right? And we forget because we've been in wars after wars after wars, And as those generations pass that remember that stone of remembrance that was piled there, that kids don't know about, our schools don't teach them about it, they haven't experienced it, they don't know what they're walking into. It's a totally different environment over there.
Well, that's an incredible example. It's an incredible example.
Well, you were talking about that before, and I got to thinking, what I am today began through my father and mother. And through his father, or his mother, or her father and her mother, there's a carry on of some of this.
Yeah.
So it's our responsibility to pass that on to our kids through experiences or whatever we go through. And we look at things a little bit differently now. I would have to say my grandfather must have been a pretty religious guy, in his own sense, because he raised people that were that way. Mom and dad, both of them.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about religion as religion.
Yeah.
I'm talking about a belief in God and understanding more, perhaps in that day than we do in this day. We see too much of the other junk that's going on. Back in those days, it was a little more, there wasn't so many things coming in from it. You were sitting out in the middle of nowhere, didn't have any experiences other than what you experienced. It says, my dad's brother was out in the middle of nowhere, Uncle Apple was just, he never was in a city. He never raised his kids anywhere like that. The biggest city was in Fortuna where I was born, and that was, 20,000 maybe at the most?
If you think today takes both parents to work to make ends meet to raise your kid. So look what's teaching your kids. The television. They're telling them what to believe, what to see. The internet, the games, it's telling them what to believe.
Well, and even at school now, the way they're, teaching the things that they're teaching in the public schools, maybe not in all, but you get in the big inner cities, and you'd be surprised to learn what they're being told. And even in your colleges, like even at your Christian universities, you got some of the most liberal professors because they have infiltrated that, and they've allowed it.
They've infiltrated everything.
Well, yeah.
Well, my dad never got a big salary. The highest salary he ever got was about $6,000, I think. And that was the final year of teaching, And nowadays, when you talk about, we had mama there at home, that was the benefit. He didn't make a lot, he made enough to live.
But most of them now don't have that at home. So their television, their internet, their computer, their phone is their babysitter.
Well, that, and now you got so many, grandparents that are raising because you've had kids that have had kids.
Most definitely. Most definitely true.
Well, and I think too, with the younger generation, because of technology and everything that they have access to, I think they almost have an arrogance, like, we're not going to get involved in a war, because now, like, we're involved, and we have not, you know what I'm saying? Do you ever sense that from them, like we're too smart to let history repeat itself?
Oh, for sure.
I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, that
It's
even-
like, that's just gonna end so badly.
Well, even like you said, at the most arrogant peak, the idea that we can do socialism right, or we can make communism work.
Oh, yeah.
Despite the fact that history tells us all those things.
They were more
Never
brainwashed over to thinking that stuff's good,
Yeah.
not that stuff's bad.
Well, then there's the entitlement issue that's intermixed and all that. I just think about, I think about the fact that so many people, even if they were raised in church, that they got religion, but they didn't get a relationship. So then as they get older, and people are like, well, why do you believe that? Like, you know, we're okay with, you know, abortion or homosexuality or like whatever. And then they start thinking about it and like they can't answer those questions. Because like they don't, like they've never had an experience with the King as Abba. And so therefore it's just religion. Well, you know, yeah, like if religion doesn't love you, then like religion's wrong. When that's not the case. Does that make sense?
All very good points, very good points.
Another interesting point in that was, it seems like whenever things go bad, they always turn back. You know, we saw 9/11, we had people on their knees for weeks, but it was only for weeks.
Yeah. I just think about the way like the New Age movement, all that is laced in Jesus. They just tweaked it enough that now they made it their own. And so they moved the marker. So it's not Jesus. It's New Age. It's, you know, they took Jesus and tweaked his word and made it their own. And they've led a lot of people astray.
Well, and then too, you know, I know, so I was flipping the TV last week, and you know, you let somebody in the public eye that has been a follower of Christ, and more than likely, not that I know these people personally, but you know, I believe their heart started out, and they started out walking with God. Somewhere along the way, they let their self, they got that ego, they got whatever, the money, the power, the whatever. And instead of continuing to walk with God and doing what God had blessed them with in the Word, then all of a sudden they're doing what's good for their, quote, what's best for the ministry, which translates what's best for the money.
Right.
But then, when that person files or whatever, our mainstream media, I mean, they are sitting there waiting with documentaries to pounce up there. I mean, I was amazed the day after the whatever with the one guy over in Australia, and I mean, they had a documentary ready to go. It was like an hour long. So, and you know, then that just, you realize how many people that takes that says, well, see, I knew that they weren't. You know, so why do I want to do that? They're no better than I am. You know, they really wasn't about this. But I don't know what you do about that. I mean, you know, other than,
I think that goes back to relationship.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
just
that's
pray-
religion.
You just pray. I mean, I know I always prayed over my children for them to have their own experiences, because nobody can take that away from
That's
you.
right. That's
You know, I mean, like the time I was working and I literally had $50 to my name and I was at a revival and the Lord said, give you $50. And I was like, excuse me, Lord, I only have $50. And you know, I work in Atlanta, I need gas, I need lunch. And he's like, give you $50. So I wrote my check for the $50, and the next morning, when I got to work, my boss, who was Jewish, the meanest man ever, had left a note in my little mailbox at work about how fabulous I was and gave me $100 check. And I was like, you know, nobody can ever take that away from me. Like when people say you can't outgive God, I mean, I can tell you. Emphatic, I'm gonna die on this hill. They're right. You can outgive God. You know, relationship.
I think that's what reason it's so important too for our children to be, they may not understand it, and they may not want to understand it. You know, I look around and I even, you know, I can remember watching Michael and Lauren as little kids, and like Chase Franklin and Ashton Roach. I can remember seeing them sitting there like that, and the Holy Spirit just moving all around them. But you know, they felt the Holy Spirit. They may not have understood it, and they may not have, but they felt it, and at some point, I believe that you yearn to feel that. And that's the reason I think it's so important for our children to experience this. I'm so happy that we have a church that lets the Holy Spirit, when the Holy Spirit wants to work, that He's allowed to work.
So true. End with prayer. I wanted to mention, so I don't forget, thank you to all of you. I appreciate it so much. It's cool. I always enjoy Wednesday nights. I love just spending time together and just not being rushed. We're not going to meet next Wednesday night because I do know it's spring break and there are going to be some folks away. And so hopefully that won't mess anybody up. But we won't meet next Wednesday night, but then we'll just jump back on track the following Wednesday. Okay. So I'll be sending that out, and I'll also mention it Sunday morning, but I just wanted to kind of throw it out to my Wednesday night folk, especially those of you that are trying to make your plans and making sure that you're, you know, we won't meet here next Wednesday night, but we'll pick up the following Wednesday night. Lord, may the words of my mouth and our mouth and the meditation of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our God. Amen. I love you. Thank you, Lori. Wonderful, wonderful. Those burrito tacos and chips.